You know, when we try to understand cold cases, we usually fall back on this X-ray machine analogy.
Right.
We think of justice as this like clinical diagnostic process.
Yeah.
You break a bone, the X-ray shows the jagged white line, the doctor points to it, and well, the problem is identified.
Yeah, and it's comforting because it implies that the evidence is always there. Like it's just waiting for the right machine to look at it.
Exactly. It's binary.
Yeah.
But the more you dig into the reality of long-term unsolved homicides, you realize the X-ray analogy is just, it's completely wrong.
Totally.
It's more like, imagine you've been handed a 1,000-piece puzzle. Half the pieces were thrown into a river 30 years ago. The picture on the box is faded to nothing, and the pieces you actually do have, they belong to 3 completely different puzzles.
It's murky. It is so deeply fragmented.
Yeah, and that fragmentation is exactly where a certain type of predator learns to thrive. So, welcome to today's deep dive. Pull up a chair. It's just you, the two of us, and a massive stack of sources that are frankly going to test the limits of what you assume about the American justice system.
We're getting into some heavy material today.
We really are. We're going through unclassified FBI files, extensive criminological research, local news archives spanning like 4 decades, and some incredible investigative reporting from projects like the Murder Book podcast. Our mission today is to unpack the chilling reality of Samuel Little.
And, the sheer volume of material on this case is overwhelming, largely because the timeline is so incredibly protracted. I mean, we are looking at an individual whose documented crimes span from the Nixon administration well into the 2000s.
Right, and here is the statistic I want you, the listener, to just sit with for a second. This is the premise that started this whole deep dive for us. Imagine a man who confesses to 93 murders.
93.
93. Spanning 35 years. And the FBI has definitively verified over 60 of them, making him the most prolific serial killer in American history.
It's almost hard to comprehend.
It is. The question that we have to answer today is the mechanics of the how. How does a man commit nearly 100 murders, drive all over the country, constantly interact with law enforcement, rack up a 100-page rap sheet, and just keep walking away?
Well, to answer that, we can't just study the psychology of the offender. We have to study the environment he operated in.
Right.
We have to deconstruct the systemic blind spots, the severe jurisdictional fragmentation of the 70s and 80s, and, the slow grinding evolution of forensic science that eventually trapped him.
So we need to start at the origin, the very beginning of the man born Samuel McDowell, who later took the name Samuel Little. The sources place his birth in 1940 in Reynolds, Georgia.
And the backdrop here is crucial.
It's extremely. We're talking about the Jim Crow South, an environment of extreme poverty and marginalization. Little himself told investigators his mother was a, quote, lady of the night, and there is documentation suggesting he might have actually been born while she was incarcerated.
Wow.
Yeah. He was essentially abandoned as an infant and sent north to be raised by his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio.
The developmental psychology here is just bleak. You have profound early childhood abandonment, lack of attachment, and an environment in Lorain that was, at the time, economically depressed and heavily segregated.
Right.
We often look for the etiology of violent behavior in these early years, and the sources reveal that his deadly obsessions, his paraphilias, began at an age that is almost difficult to comprehend.
I read the FBI interview transcripts, and he claimed his fixation on the female neck started when he was 5 years old.
5.
5. He said he saw his kindergarten teacher touch her throat, and that completely mundane action somehow just rewired his developing brain.
It's a terrifying example of how paraphilic development works, actually.
I hope so.
Well, a completely neutral stimulus like a neck or a throat becomes paired with a nascent developing sexual schema. Over time, that fixation solidifies.
Yeah.
He admitted to investigators that by the time he was 7 or 8, he was harboring a conscious, active desire to kill.
At 8 years old.
Yes, he was already fantasizing about it.
But, a fantasy, even a violent one, doesn't automatically translate into a 35-year killing spree. Lots of people have dark thoughts. They don't become serial killers.
Exactly.
He needed a specific set of skills and a specific environment to actualize those thoughts. And that brings us to his teenage years. His criminal record didn't start in adulthood. It started at age 13.
Right. Bicycle theft, shoplifting.
Yeah, and escalating to armed robbery. He spent significant time in the juvenile justice system. But while he was in those institutions, he picked up a skill that became the mechanical foundation of his murders. He became a highly trained, highly effective, competitive boxer.
And the boxing. is the central biomechanical detail of his methodology. We will get into the physical mechanics of that shortly, but you are right to point out that skill alone isn't enough. He needed the right environment. He needed invisibility.
Which brings me to a quote he gave to the journalist Gillian Lauren. When she asked him how he managed to avoid detection for so long, he was incredibly blunt. He said, I never killed no senators or governors. I stayed in the ghetto.
Yeah.
He specifically intentionally targeted sex workers, drug addicts, unhoused women, and predominantly women of color.
Because he was exploiting a well-documented sociological phenomenon that criminologists refer to as the less dead.
The less dead. It's such a grim term.
It is grim, but it accurately describes individuals from marginalized sectors of society whose disappearances simply do not trigger the same level of police resources, media coverage, or public outcry as victims from more affluent demographics.
It's the uncomfortable truth of how investigations were prioritized back then. I mean, if a college student in a wealthy suburb goes missing, there are helicopters, search parties, press conferences. Right.
If a woman struggling with addiction on the fringes of society disappears, the assumption back then was often that she just moved on or didn't want to be found.
And Little was chillingly aware of this bias. He weaponized the system's own apathy against it. He knew that if he targeted women living high-risk lifestyles, the authorities would often look the other way.
Yeah.
And even if a body was discovered, the victim's history frequently led medical examiners and detectives to assume a non-homicidal cause of death. You know, a drug overdose, perhaps, or exposure.
Okay, I understand targeting marginalized communities. But the logistics of this still baffle me. I mean, serial killers in popular culture usually have a base of operations.
Yeah.
A house with a basement, a steady job to maintain a facade, a specific hunting ground. John Wayne Gacy had his crawl space. Dahmer had his apartment. Samuel Little was completely transient. How do you fund a transcontinental killing spree for 35 years without a job?
He operated as a nomadic ghost. His entire existence was predicated on constant motion. I mean, he lived out of his vehicles for nearly half a century.
And the funding came from a relentless stream of petty crime. He was a prolific shoplifter. He would hit retail stores, steal clothing, electronics, cartons of cigarettes, and fence them for cash.
Just constantly hustling.
Constantly. Later in life, he relied on Social Security benefits loaded onto a prepaid debit card, which gave him total geographic independence. He could commit a crime in Florida on a Tuesday and be halfway to California by Thursday.
And while he was living this transient life, he wasn't always the solitary drifter we picture. The sources detail a relationship that provided him with an incredible layer of camouflage. In 1971, he met a woman named Aurelia Jean Dorsey. She was 27 years older than him.
Right.
And they traveled together for years.
It's a fascinating dynamic. She served as this strange amalgam of a surrogate mother figure, an accomplice in his shoplifting rings, and a traveling companion.
I try to picture this from the perspective of a patrol officer in the 70s. You pull over a dusty Ford Pinto on the highway. You look inside, and you don't see a lone predatory drifter. You see a man traveling with an elderly woman.
It instantly diffuses suspicion.
Right. It doesn't fit any profile of a serial killer.
It provided a very effective veneer of normalcy. They remained together, traveling and shoplifting, until she passed away from a brain hemorrhage in 1988. Her presence undoubtedly helped him fly under the radar during some of his most active years.
So we have the environment, we have the camouflage, and we have the victimology. Now we have to look at the physical reality of the crimes themselves. The LAPD eventually branded him the choke and stroke killer.
It's a graphic moniker.
It is, but it cuts to the core of his incredibly specific modus operandi. I want to walk through this carefully, keeping it clinical, because understanding the mechanics of how he killed is the only way to understand how he evaded forensic detection.
Absolutely. The mechanics are everything in this case.
He would use his charm to lure women into his vehicle. The sources note he was actually quite charismatic when he needed to be. He drove massive, heavy cars. A 1978 yellow Cadillac Eldorado was one of his favorites, or a Ford Pinto.
Right.
He would offer cash or drugs or a ride, get them into the passenger seat, and then drive to highly isolated locations, dirt roads, swamps, abandoned lots, cornfields, places where nobody would hear anything.
And this is the moment where his background as a competitive boxer becomes paramount to the forensic reality of the crime scene.
See, I've read about the boxing, but mechanically, how does one punch erase a crime scene? I mean, a murder is inherently chaotic.
Think about a typical struggle for survival. If an attacker uses a knife or attempts to overpower a conscious victim, the victim fights back.
Right.
That fight generates a massive amount of physical evidence: scratches on the attacker's face, torn clothing, defensive wounds on the victim's hands and forearms. Most importantly, the victim often captures the attacker's DNA under their fingernails.
Because they're clawing at them.
Exactly. It's chaotic, it's bloody, and it leaves a profound forensic footprint.
Because the body's central nervous system is in total fight-or-flight mode.
Precisely. But Little bypassed all of that. Utilizing his boxing training, he would deliver a single, thunderous knockout punch to the victim's head or jaw. He wasn't just hitting them, he knew exactly how to strike to induce immediate unconsciousness.
So he effectively shut off their central nervous system before they even knew they were in a fight for their lives.
By stunning them instantly, he eliminated the struggle. He eliminated the defensive wounds. He created an almost sterile environment for the actual murder.
Which brings us to the cause of death, manual strangulation. But again, the sources point out he did this in a very idiosyncratic way.
Yeah, so in forensic pathology, manual strangulation often presents with very specific internal injuries. Most notably, the fracture of the hyoid bone.
The hyoid bone?
Right. It's a small, U-shaped bone situated at the base of the tongue, right in the front of the neck. When significant pressure is applied during strangulation, that bone frequently snaps. For a medical examiner, a fractured hyoid is a massive red flag indicating homicide.
But Little didn't usually break it.
No. Because of his unusually large hands and the specific prolonged way he applied pressure, he later described it to investigators as suffocating them as much as he was strangling them. He often managed to kill the victim without fracturing the hyoid bone.
That is wild. I mean, put yourself in the shoes of a local medical examiner in 1975 or 1980. A body is found in an overgrown lot. The victim is a known sex worker or struggles with heavy addiction. There are no bullet holes, there are no stab wounds, there are no obvious defensive scratches, and internally, the hyoid bone is completely intact.
Right, and the medical examiner, lacking the broader context that a transcontinental serial predator is operating in their specific jurisdiction, looks at the circumstantial evidence.
Yeah.
They see a marginalized victim, perhaps with narcotics in their toxicology report. Without clear, unmistakable signs of violent trauma, the path of least resistance is to misclassify the death.
They rule it an accidental overdose, or a natural death due to exposure, or simply undetermined.
And the moment that ruling is made, the crime is effectively erased from the official record. There is no homicide investigation because, legally speaking, no homicide occurred.
Oh.
The local detectives don't start knocking on doors or looking for a suspect. The case is closed before it ever opens.
It is a terrifying structural blind spot. And what makes it even more chilling is that Little wasn't just getting lucky. He was actively studying how to maintain that blind spot.
Yes, he was.
The FBI files show that as a teenager, he was obsessed with true crime magazines. He wasn't just reading them for the sensationalism.
Not at all. He was treating them as academic texts. He told interrogators later in life that those magazines taught him the fundamental principles of forensic science.
Look what?
Well, he learned about the transfer of fibers. He learned about the importance of fingerprints. He learned exactly what homicide detectives were trained to look for at a crime scene.
It's like he was reading the true crime magazines as an instruction manual for forensic evasion.
That's exactly what he was doing.
He figured out the rules of the game just so he could break them without leaving a trace.
He reverse-engineered his entire methodology based on what the authorities needed for a conviction, and then deliberately withheld those specific elements. And while he was doing this, his internal psychology was constructing a bizarre web of extreme narcissism and delusion to justify the violence.
The psychological justifications are completely contradictory, too. On one hand, he claimed he was commissioned by God to alleviate the misery of his victims, that he was sending them to a better place.
A classic savior delusion.
Yeah. But then on the other hand, he would say he was possessed by the devil. And despite the deeply sexual nature of his crimes, he openly admitted he became sexually aroused by the act of strangulation itself, holding his victims while they died. He reacted with absolute fury if anyone labeled him a rapist.
He violently rejected that label. He constructed an internal narrative where the initial interactions and sexual acts were always consensual.
Even though he was manipulating them or offering drugs?
Right. In his mind, he wasn't a sexual predator taking something by force. He was a willing participant in a transaction that merely ended in a divinely ordained death. He compartmentalized the violence to protect his own ego.
So we have this predator. He's highly mobile. He's targeting victims society ignores. He's using a biomechanical method that leaves almost no evidence, and he's constantly altering his geography. You would think he operated completely in the shadows,
You would think so.
but that is the most infuriating part of this entire deep dive. He wasn't in the shadows at all. The system had him. They had him constantly.
And this is where the narrative shifts from the cunning of a killer to the catastrophic failures of the criminal justice system.
By 1975, Samuel Little had a rap sheet that was roughly 100 pages long. Think about that, 100 pages.
That's absurd.
He had been arrested over 26 times across 11 different states. He wasn't hiding in a bunker. He was churning through the lower gears of the justice system every single year for assault, armed robbery, shoplifting, fraud. He was constantly in front of judges and police officers.
But the system was incredibly fragmented. A conviction for assault in a municipal court in Ohio did not raise a red flag for a homicide detective in Florida.
Right.
There was no centralized instant database connecting these low-level offenses to a broader pattern of lethal violence.
And when the system finally did connect the dots and brought him up on murder charges, the legal machinery broke down entirely. We have to look closely at the early 80s. There are two specific agonizing trials where he was right there sitting at the defense table and the system let him walk.
The legal technicalities of those failures perfectly illustrate how societal bias infiltrates the courtroom.
Let's start with 1982, Gainesville, Florida. A 26-year-old woman named Patricia Mount is found nude and strangled in a hayfield. The sources note she was developmentally disabled. Her IQ was reportedly around 40. She was incredibly vulnerable. The local police actually do exceptional work here. They find eyewitnesses who saw Patricia leaving a local bar with Samuel Little. They recover hairs from her body that microscopically match Little. They arrest him, the prosecutor charges him with murder, and they go to trial.
On paper, that is a solid circumstantial case.
Yeah.
You have eyewitness timeline placement and trace physical evidence. In a functioning system, this is where the killing spree ends.
So what exactly happened in that courtroom? How does a jury look at that evidence and let him go?
It comes down to the defense strategy of witness impeachment.
Okay.
The defense attorneys didn't just attack the physical evidence, they aggressively attacked the character of the witnesses. The people who saw Little with Patricia Mount were, like his victims, from marginalized backgrounds. The defense painted them as unreliable, untrustworthy, perhaps intoxicated themselves.
So they put the witnesses on trial instead of the defendant.
Exactly. And the tragic reality is that the jury bought into it. They allowed their biases regarding the socioeconomic status of the witnesses to overshadow the facts of the case. It took the jury just 30 minutes to deliberate and return a verdict of not guilty.
30 minutes. The local detectives who worked that case must have been absolutely sick to their stomachs.
I can't even imagine.
And before the dust even settles on that failure, it happens again. 1984, Pascagoula, Mississippi. A 22-year-old woman named Melinda Lepre is found dead in a cemetery ditch. She had been strangled. Again, eyewitnesses come forward. They identify Little's vehicle, a distinctive Ford Pinto, in the area.
But the Mississippi case had something the Florida case didn't. They had living survivors.
This detail is harrowing. The investigators found two women, Hilda Nelson and Layla McLean. Both had survived brutal attacks by Samuel Little. They had been beaten and strangled. Layla McLean actually fought back, managed to escape his car, and ran half-dressed across 4 lanes of moving traffic to save her own life. Yeah, these women were willing to sit on the witness stand, point directly at Samuel Little, and say, "He is the man who did this to me."
It's the strongest possible testimony a prosecutor can hope for. Eyewitness identification from a survivor of a remarkably similar attack.
But it never even goes to trial. The district attorney takes it to a grand jury, and the grand jury refuses to indict him. I struggle to comprehend the legal logic here. How do you ignore survivors?
Well, the prosecutors in the grand jury deemed the survivors unreliable.
Why?
Because they were sex workers. Because they struggled with addiction. The legal apparatus essentially decided that because these women engaged in illegal or stigmatized behavior to survive, their trauma was invalid. Their status as marginalized citizens stripped them of their credibility in the eyes of the law.
So because they were sex workers, it was legally acceptable that a man beat and strangled them. That is the message the system sent.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the less dead theory in a legal setting. Defense attorneys routinely exploited societal prejudices to destroy witness credibility, and prosecutors, anticipating this tactic, often preemptively refused to file charges, believing juries simply wouldn't convict on the word of a sex worker.
It is maddening, and it forces you to look at how the legal system itself inadvertently became an accessory to his ongoing crimes. The veteran police officers, the ones who were actually on the streets pulling him over and taking these reports, expressed profound frustration.
Rightly so.
They felt that the post-arrest justice system was bending over backward to protect the constitutional rights of a violent repeat offender while showing absolute zero compassion or protection for the marginalized women he was hunting.
And this systemic failure reaches its absolute nadir with the plea deals.
The San Diego plea deal, this is later in 1984. He has literally just walked away from murder charges in Florida and Mississippi. He travels to San Diego. He kidnaps and strangles a woman named Lori Barros. She survives by playing dead and immediately goes to the police. A month later, police are patrolling, and they literally find Samuel Little in the back seat of his car with another woman, Tanya Jackson. She's unconscious. She has been beaten and strangled. They caught him in the actual commission of the crime.
They finally catch him red-handed.
Yes, they arrest him, and they take him to trial for attempted murder and kidnapping.
But the trial results in a hung jury.
Why? How is that even possible?
Because the defense used the exact same playbook. They introduced doubt based on the victim's background, and they brought in his elderly traveling companion, Aurelia Dorsey, to provide an alibi and character testimony. The jury couldn't reach a unanimous decision.
So, facing the prospect of having to spend the time and money on a second trial, the district attorney's office offers him a plea deal. For kidnapping, brutally beating, and nearly strangling 2 women to death, Samuel Little is sentenced to prison. But he serves just 2.5 years.
2.5 years for predatory, near-lethal violence.
He is released in February of 1987, and the sources trace his movements immediately after his release. He doesn't lay low, he doesn't rehabilitate, he drives straight to Los Angeles, and over the next few years, he murders at least 10 more women.
The jurisdictional fragmentation allowed him to continuously hit the reset button on his identity. To the LAPD, he was just another low-level transient moving into the city. They had no immediate way of knowing he had just narrowly avoided murder convictions in 3 different states.
The sheer scale of the institutional failure is staggering. So the question becomes, how does a 35-year nightmare enabled by a broken system finally end? We have to jump forward in the timeline to September 2012.
Okay, 2012.
Samuel Little is now 71 years old. His health is rapidly failing. He suffers from advanced diabetes, a severe heart condition, and he is confined to a wheelchair. He is living at the Wayside Christian Homeless Shelter in Louisville, Kentucky.
He's aged out of his physical prime, but he is still in the wind.
But the police aren't looking for a prolific serial killer. They arrest him on a simple, outstanding narcotics warrant from California. They process him, put him on a plane, and extradite him back to Los Angeles to face the drug charge.
And this is the exact moment where the slow evolution of forensic science finally outpaces his ability to manipulate the system. By 2012, DNA technology had fundamentally transformed the investigative landscape.
Right.
It went from being a nascent, highly specialized tool in the 1980s to the absolute backbone of criminal justice.
In Los Angeles, you have detectives Mitzi Roberts and Rodrigo Amador working cold cases. They see this 71-year-old transient come into the system on a drug charge, and as a matter of routine protocol, they swab his cheek and run his DNA profile through CODIS.
CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the national database.
Right.
And it's worth noting, when Little was committing his crimes in the 70s and 80s, CODIS didn't exist. He couldn't reverse engineer his crimes against the technology that hadn't been invented yet.
Exactly, and the database gets a hit. It's not a hit for a minor assault or a burglary. The computer matches Samuel Little's DNA to 3 unsolved cold case murders from Los Angeles, specifically from 1987 and 1989, right after he was released from that San Diego plea deal.
The timing is incredible.
The victims were Carol Linda Alford, Audrey Nelson Everett, and Guadalupe Duarte Apodaca.
We need to look closely at the physical evidence recovered from these 3 scenes, because it illustrates exactly why DNA became the great equalizer in this narrative.
Walk us through it.
Well, Carol Alford was found in a Los Angeles alleyway. She was nude from the waist down and had been manually strangled. The cold case detectives had preserved the physical evidence, and Little's DNA was definitively found on her clothing. Guadalupe Apodaca was discovered in an abandoned auto repair shop. Again, his DNA was recovered from the scene. But the Audrey Nelson case, that one is the most visceral.
Because Audrey Nelson fought back.
She did. Her body was found in a dumpster behind a nightclub. She had been brutally beaten before the strangulation. But in her final, desperate moments, she managed to scratch her attacker. She captured his biological material under her fingernails.
And the sources note a heartbreaking detail here. Across those fingernails, she had the words "true love" tattooed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, those fingernails held the key to bypassing the systemic bias that had protected him for decades. Think about the courtroom failures we just discussed. In 1982 and 1984, the defense attorneys won by putting the victims' lifestyles on trial.
Right, they cross-examined the survivors to make juries doubt them.
Exactly. But you cannot cross-examine a DNA profile.
A DNA match doesn't have a socioeconomic status. It doesn't have a criminal record.
It is objective biological truth. It is a mathematical certainty that his cellular material was present during the commission of the crime.
So, in 2014, Samuel Little finally faces a murder trial where the evidence actually sticks. The prosecutor, Beth Silverman, built an ironclad case. She utilized the undeniable DNA evidence connecting him to the 3 Los Angeles murders, and she successfully petitioned the court to allow the testimony of the women who had survived his attacks in other states years earlier.
Establishing the pattern.
Exactly. They established the pattern.
And throughout the trial, Little sat in his wheelchair, appearing largely unfazed by the proceedings. He maintained this facade of the innocent, misunderstood old man.
Right up until the verdict was read. When the jury found him guilty, he lost it. He screamed, "I didn't do it!" He yelled at the judge, calling the entire trial a lynching. But the theatrics didn't matter anymore. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole.
Finally.
As he was being wheeled out, Detective Mitzi Roberts actually waved goodbye to him.
From a traditional narrative standpoint, that is the end of the story. The monster is caught by modern science, locked in a cage, and society is safe.
But the LAPD cold case detectives knew better. You don't just suddenly start killing with immense proficiency in 1987 and abruptly retire in 1989.
No, you don't. They knew those 3 women in Los Angeles were just the tip of a massive iceberg. And this is where the story shifts from a cold case investigation into an unprecedented psychological excavation.
The LAPD flagged Samuel Little to the FBI. Specifically, they contact VICAP.
The Violent Criminal Apprehension Program.
Right.
VICAP is designed specifically to connect the dots across jurisdictional lines. You have analysts like Christina Palazzolo and Angela Williamson, and they start doing the painstaking work of overlaying Samuel Little's massive 100-page rap sheet with unsolved murders of marginalized women across the country.
They start looking at his movements, like, okay, he was arrested for shoplifting in Odessa, Texas in 1994. Do we have any unsolved homicides matching his MO in Odessa in 1994?
And they find one, a woman named Denise Christie Brothers. The pattern matches perfectly.
But having a pattern on a spreadsheet isn't enough to close a case. They need a confession. They need someone to actually sit in a room with a psychopathic serial killer who hates law enforcement and get him to voluntarily admit to crimes he hasn't been charged with.
Enter Texas Ranger James Holland.
Yes.
Holland had built a reputation in law enforcement as a sort of serial killer whisperer. In the spring of 2018, Holland flies out to the California State Prison where Little is serving his life sentences.
The dynamic in that interrogation room is fascinating to me. Little is initially extremely hostile. He despises the police. His standard tactic was to use anger and belligerence to dominate the room and force investigators to leave.
So Holland has to employ a very highly disciplined, counterintuitive psychological approach. If you or I were sitting across from a man who murdered dozens of women, our instinct would be to demand answers, to confront him with the morality of his actions.
Right, to ask, how could you do this?
Which is exactly what you cannot do with a psychopath.
Yeah.
Holland understood that rule number 1 in this scenario is never, ever ask for remorse.
It's like speaking a foreign language to them. Holland explained that if you step into an interrogation room and try to appeal to their moral psyche, if you ask them, "Don't you feel bad for the families?" or "Look at the humanity of this victim," they literally cannot process it.
No.
They possess a complete and total lack of empathy. If you push the moral angle, they shut down immediately, and you get nothing.
Holland knew he had to build a rapport based entirely on utility and a twisted sense of shared interest. He had to convince Little that he didn't view him as a monster, even though Holland knew he was sitting across from the very definition of evil. He had to stroke Little's ego.
So Holland brings food. Fast food becomes the key to unlocking the worst serial killer in American history.
It's bizarre but effective.
Over the course of hundreds of hours of interviews spanning months, Holland brings Little his favorites: pizza, Dr. Pepper, and grits. They sit there eating pizza, and they talk about sports, they talk about life on the road. Holland intentionally addresses him by his childhood nickname, Sammy.
And Little reciprocates. He starts calling the Texas Ranger Jimmy. Little even told a reporter for the LA Times later that he felt he had found a friend in a Texas Ranger. It is a profound manipulation of false intimacy.
And that false intimacy is what finally broke the dam. Little started treating the interrogation like a game of shock value. He wanted to see if he could repulse Holland. He would describe in incredibly graphic detail how he stalked and murdered a woman, and he would stare directly into Holland's eyes, studying his facial muscles for any sign of disgust or judgment.
Which meant Holland had to perform the ultimate acting job. He had to sit there listening to the most horrific descriptions of violence imaginable and maintain a completely blank, interested, non-judgmental expression.
If Holland flinched, if he broke eye contact in disgust, Little would realize he was being judged and he would stop talking. Holland had to normalize the horror so that Little would keep bragging.
Because for Samuel Little, these interrogations weren't confessions of guilt, they were reminiscences of his greatest triumphs. He was reliving the power and the control through his memories.
Over 700 hours of interviews, the floodgates opened. Samuel Little calmly confessed to 93 murders. But this brings up a massive logistical problem.
Right.
How on earth do authorities verify 93 separate confessions from an 80-year-old man in failing health? A man who had been heavily abusing drugs and alcohol for decades. You would assume his brain would be completely fried, that his memories would be a jumbled mess of hallucinations and faded reality. How is a taped confession to a Texas Ranger enough to close a 40-year-old cold case?
That is the central paradox of his cognition. We encounter the terrifying reality of his neurology. Samuel Little possessed an eidetic or photographic memory, but highly compartmentalized.
Okay, what does that mean in this context?
He struggled immensely with linear time. He might be off by 10 or 15 years regarding the date of a murder, but his spatial awareness, his geographic recall, and his visual memory for faces and locations were flawless.
The sources outline the granularity of his recall, and it is genuinely chilling. He couldn't remember the year, but he could remember exactly what mile marker on Interstate 10 he pulled over at 40 years ago.
Wow.
He remembered if a specific victim had a gap in her teeth or wore dentures. He remembered a unique set of architectural arches near a crime scene in Florida. And then he took it a step further. He asked Holland for art supplies.
And the forensic art phase of this investigation is just unprecedented. Ranger Holland provided him with pastels and paper, and Little began to draw.
Sitting in his prison cell, he drew dozens and dozens of incredibly accurate portraits of the women he murdered entirely from memory decades after the fact.
It's hard to believe.
He captured their hairstyles, the specific shade of their eye color, the exact jewelry or clothing they were wearing on the night they died. He told a journalist, "I live in my mind now, with my babies, in my drawings."
It is a grotesque, pathological nostalgia. He viewed these women as his possessions, and he was archiving them.
But from a purely investigative standpoint, those drawings were the Rosetta Stone. They became walking forensic maps. The FBI took these sketches, compiled them into a database, and released them to the public, hoping to trigger the memories of families who had been searching for decades, or local cold case detectives who had a Jane Doe file sitting in a cabinet.
To understand exactly how these memories and drawings translated into verified case closures, we need to examine the mechanisms of specific confessions from the FBI tapes.
Let's look at how his memory navigated a deviation in his MO, the 1982 New Orleans case. In the interview tapes with Holland, Little is describing a night in New Orleans. He remembers meeting a woman at a nightclub. He describes her vividly, about 30 years old, tall, honey-colored skin, wearing a pretty dress with buttons down the front.
So specific.
Very. He remembers she was there attending a birthday party for her sister. He charms her, dances with her, and offers her a ride in his Lincoln.
He remembers the exact route, too. He tells Holland he drove out towards Slidell, took the Little Woods exit, and drove down a dirt road adjacent to a bayou.
And he remembers a very specific industrial detail. There was a dredging machine operating in the water nearby. He parks the car. But here is where his memory validates the crime. He tells Holland that he dragged her to the water and drowned her. He specifically states, "That's the only one that I ever killed by drowning."
Why the sudden change in his established methodology?
Because, he recalled, she was physically too strong for him to strangle effectively. She fought back hard enough that he had to alter his approach. He remembered leaving half her body submerged under the water with her legs resting on the muddy bank.
40 years later, local authorities pull the cold case file. The location matches the Little Woods exit. The cause of death matches drowning. And historical records confirm the presence of a dredging operation in that specific bayou in 1982. The internal consistency of his narrative matches the external verifiable data.
Or look at the North Little Rock case, which occurred sometime between 1992 and 1994. He tells Holland he meets a woman and they camp together for 3 days. They decide to go shoplifting at a local Kroger grocery store, but they get caught. Little actually gets arrested by local police for shoplifting. He's held in a cell for about 3 hours and then released on a citation. He walks back to his yellow Cadillac and the woman is still sleeping inside. The next day, he drives her down a dirt road, strangles her, and leaves her body on a specific, distinctive pile of branches and old corn stalks.
The Kroger detail is the investigative linchpin here. A memory of old corn stalks is hard to verify. An arrest record is not.
Exactly. The FBI contacts the North Little Rock Police Department. They ask them to dig into their microfiche or old physical archives, and they find it. The records show that the North Little Rock Police did, in fact, arrest Samuel Little for shoplifting at a Kroger on April 20th, 1994.
That is how the verification process works. You anchor his visual, geographic memories to documented bureaucratic records. Once you establish his presence at the exact time and place through an arrest record, the confession regarding the homicide becomes immensely credible.
The geographic recall is just as stunning. Take the Covington, Kentucky case from 1984. He confesses to picking up a 25-year-old blonde woman with a hippie appearance outside a strip club in Columbus, Ohio. They drive south down Interstate 75, cross the river into Kentucky.
Right.
He tells investigators he drove up a specific dirt road that had a strip of grass growing right down the middle between the tire tracks. He drives to the top of a little round hill, strangles her in the back seat, and leaves her body partially concealed by the vegetation.
He is providing topographical maps from memory. Local authorities in Covington were able to use those specific environmental descriptors, the grassy dirt road, the little round hill, to definitively match his confession to an unsolved Jane Doe homicide they're in jurisdiction.
But this incredible process of confession and verification brings us to a really complex, deeply frustrating legal paradox, specifically the double jeopardy clause of the U.S. Constitution.
It is a bitter pill for law enforcement to swallow.
Let's go back to 1982. Patricia Mount in Gainesville, Florida. The woman with the 40 IQ where the jury took 30 minutes to acquit him. During his hundreds of hours with Ranger Holland, Samuel Little explicitly, graphically confessed to murdering her. He described pulling off on a dirt road, massaging her neck to relax her, and then strangling her. He admitted the whole thing. The state finally had their smoking gun.
But under the Fifth Amendment, an individual cannot be prosecuted twice for the same crime. It is a fundamental tenet of our legal system designed to prevent the government from endlessly harassing a citizen with trials until they get a conviction.
So, wait, just to be absolutely clear, you have a man who has confessed on tape to a Texas Ranger. The confession is verified by his knowledge of the crime scene. Everyone knows he did it. And the state of Florida can do absolutely nothing. They can't charge him.
Legally, no. Because he was tried and acquitted by a jury in 1982, jeopardy attached. The acquittal is final. Even with a full, videotaped, verified confession, the state cannot put him on trial for the murder of Patricia Mount again.
That has to be utterly agonizing for the original detectives who worked that case and knew he was guilty in '82.
It is deeply frustrating. However, the legal inability to prosecute doesn't mean the confession is useless. The lead cold case detective in Alachua County stated that while they can't put him in a courtroom, the confession allows them to officially, administratively close the case. It changes the status from unsolved to cleared.
Which means if they ever locate Patricia Mount's family, they can sit down with them and provide a definitive, absolute answer about what happened to her. They can explain exactly how the trial failed, but confirm who took her life. Closure in these specific instances has to substitute for legal justice.
And we are seeing modern science step in to help provide that closure in ways that weren't possible even 5 years ago. You mentioned earlier that many of the women Little drew and confessed to killing were Jane Does. They had no names. They were buried in potter's fields.
But that is changing rapidly. Labs like Othram are revolutionizing the way we identify these victims using forensic genetic genealogy, or FGG.
It's important to understand how FGG differs from the traditional CODIS database that caught Little in 2012.
How so?
Well, CODIS relies on matching about 20 core loci-specific markers to see if the DNA from a crime scene directly matches a known offender in the system. It's a direct one-to-one match. If you aren't in the system, CODIS is blind to you.
But forensic genetic genealogy doesn't need the victim or the killer to be in a police database. Labs extract whatever degraded, decades-old DNA was left at the crime scenes or from the remains of the Jane Does, and they look at hundreds of thousands of genetic markers, SNPs. They build a comprehensive genetic profile.
And then they upload that profile into public genealogy databases, the kinds of sites people use to find their ancestry.
Exactly. They aren't looking for a direct match, they're looking for cousins, second cousins, distant relatives. They build massive family trees backward and then trace them forward until they find the missing branch. They are taking the faces that Samuel Little sketched from memory, and they are finally giving them their names back. They are returning these women to their families.
It represents a monumental shift in the investigative landscape. FGG is becoming the gold standard for resolving the historical backlog of unidentified victims created by killers like Little.
Which brings us to the end of the timeline. Samuel Little's health finally gave out. He died in a California hospital on December 30th, 2020. He was 80 years old. He undoubtedly took some of his secrets to the grave, but he left behind a verified, incredibly grim ledger of 93 victims.
The final tally is staggering. It completely dwarfs the confirmed numbers of infamous household name killers like Gary Ridgway, John Wayne Gacy, or Ted Bundy. But the true legacy of this case isn't the macabre record he set.
No, it's much darker than a number.
The true crime here is the systemic failure, the enduring tragedy of the less dead. Samuel Little did not evade capture for 35 years because he was an evil genius who executed perfectly planned high-tech crimes.
Right.
He survived and thrived because society, and by extension the criminal justice system of that era, historically undervalued the lives of the people he was killing.
The families of these 93 women spent decades without answers. And it wasn't because the physical evidence didn't exist or because the police never crossed paths with him. It was because the systemic bias against marginalized women, particularly women of color, sex workers, and those struggling with poverty or addiction, created an environment of absolute impunity.
The lesson of Samuel Little is a harsh one. When we fragment our investigations, when we allow sociological bias to dictate who is a credible witness and who isn't, and when we decide that certain victims aren't worth the resources, predators thrive in those blind spots.
It forces us to take a really hard look in the mirror at how the justice system operates. Who does it protect instinctively, and who does it ignore until it's forced to look? So, to bring this all the way back to where we started, that broken X-ray machine, the puzzle with the missing pieces, Samuel Little was only finally stopped because of a retroactive DNA hit in 2012.
Yeah.
And the full, horrifying scope of his crimes was only revealed because of his own bizarre, pathological, photographic memory and a Texas Ranger who figured out how to use pizza to hack a psychopath's ego.
It was an incredibly specific, incredibly fragile chain of events that finally brought the truth to the surface. If any one of those links breaks, if he doesn't get arrested for drugs in Kentucky, if he doesn't like to draw, he dies anonymously in his shelter.
So here is the thought I want to leave you with today as we wrap up this deep dive. If it took that impossibly specific combination of modern science, a cold case detective running a routine swab, and the killer's own vanity to finally close the book on 93 murders, how many other cold cases from the 70s and 80s are sitting in cardboard boxes right now?
It's a haunting question.
Cases where the victims were deemed the less dead. Cases where the suspect was acquitted because the witnesses were sex workers. How many unsolved files are waiting for science to catch up to killers who didn't draw pictures of their victims?
It's a sobering reality. And it is exactly why the continued advancement of forensic science and the active dismantling of systemic bias in the courtroom is so absolutely critical.
Thank you for pulling up a chair and joining us for this deep dive. Stay curious, keep questioning the history you think you know, and we'll see you next time.